The year was 1847, and London lay shrouded in a soft haze of coal smoke and morning fog, the kind that blurred edges and disguised decay beneath the illusion of grandeur. Carriages rumbled over cobblestones slick with last night's rain, and lamplighters moved like ghosts retreating from dawn. In the quiet districts west of the Thames, the scent of damp earth and horse leather mixed with the perfume of lilacs from gated gardens. It was a city divided, between titles and tradesmen, silk and soot, and nowhere was that contrast more cruelly visible than in the drawing-rooms of the fallen elite. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb sat by a tall, rain-streaked window, her reflection faint against the pale light. At 22, she bore the kind of beauty that appeared unintentional, an unpolished grace shaped more by endurance than luxury. Her gown, though simple, carried the faded memory of refinement. Once she had been a fixture in London season, praised for her wit and quiet charm, the daughter of Viscount Whitcomb, whose lineage reached back to Tudor courts. But fortunes are fickle companions, and scandal had a way of devouring even the proudest names. Her father's dealings, ill-timed investments in the railways and whispered accusations of falsified accounts, had left their family disgraced. The Whitcomb estate was stripped, the servants dismissed, and creditors now called where guests once did. The newspapers, with their taste for scandal, feasted on their fall. Eleanor had learned to move through rooms where pity was disguised as civility and invitations arrived out of habit rather than affection. The world of titles and debutantes she once knew had drawn its circle closed, leaving her father coughing behind drawn curtains and her future shrinking by the day. It was then that her father had summoned her with trembling hands, his voice carrying both apology and command. The Duke of Alsford had made an offer: marriage, respectable, expedient, and cold. To the Duke, it was not love but necessity, a political alignment to restore the appearance of domestic virtue after years of widowhood. To the Whitcombs, it was salvation, a bridge back into a world that had long since turned its face away. The arrangement was whispered through lawyers and sealed in ink before Eleanor had even seen the man she was to marry. She had heard of him, of course. The Duke of Alsford was 10 years her senior, a figure admired for his composure and feared for his severity. Rumor claimed his heart had frozen the day his first wife died, a tragic carriage accident that left him a widower with a ruined faith in affection. He was said to dine in silence, to keep his staff in military order, and to write speeches for Parliament by candlelight long after the city slept. His mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess, had pressed him to remarry to preserve the family line and its standing at court. The Duke had chosen Eleanor, not for her charm nor her grace, but for her usefulness, a lady of birth yet desperate enough to accept any condition. The morning she first saw him was grey and cold, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked stone. He arrived at the Whitcomb townhouse with minimal ceremony, tall, lean, dressed impeccably but without ostentation. His eyes were a storm-colored blue, unflinching, assessing, as though she were a document to be signed rather than a woman to be wed. Yet, beneath that reserve, there was something wounded, a man who had once believed in tenderness and found it wanting. Their conversation was brief. He spoke of propriety, of expectations, of mutual understanding. She listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart steady not from courage but exhaustion. When he asked if she would consent, she nodded with quiet dignity, aware that her choice was no choice at all. In his gaze, she saw neither affection nor cruelty, only an agreement silently acknowledged between two people trapped by different forms of duty. Their wedding took place 3 weeks later in a modest ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square. The pews were filled not with friends but with observers, those curious to see how far the Whitcomb daughter had fallen and how far the Duke was willing to descend. Eleanor stood beneath the vaulted ceiling, her hands clasped around a bouquet of white heather, its meaning, protection and solitude, unknown to most but not to her. The Duke's voice was steady as he recited his vows, each word deliberate, as if read from a contract. She answered softly, her own voice barely rising above the echo of the church organ. When it was done, applause murmured through the hall like rain against glass. That evening, as the carriage carried them toward Alesford Hall, Eleanor looked through the window at the passing countryside. The fields stretched endlessly, green fading into mist, the horizon swallowed by twilight. Beside her, the Duke sat silent, his gloved hands resting on a silver-tipped cane. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her, an obligation, perhaps, or merely a reprieve from scrutiny. Yet beneath her composure, a quiet defiance stirred. She would not be pitied. If she were to live within his world of marble and restraint, she would do so with dignity intact. When they arrived, Alsford Hall loomed ahead like a fortress carved from shadow. Its towers pierced the fog, its windows aglow with faint candlelight. Servants lined the entrance, bowing in practiced precision. Inside, the corridors stretched long and echoing, portraits of solemn ancestors staring down from gilded frames. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old wood polish. It was beautiful, but it did not feel like home. The Duke showed her to her chambers, separate from his, though adjoining through a discreet corridor. His tone was formal but not unkind. "If there is anything you require, you need only ask," he said. She thanked him, though she knew such requests were not meant to be made. When he left, the silence in the room grew heavy, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. She removed her veil and stared at herself in the mirror. The reflection that met her eyes was both familiar and foreign, a duchess now, by law if not by heart. In the days that followed, Eleanor learned the rhythm of the household. Breakfast was taken in silence. Letters were written, visits received, appearances maintained. The Dowager Duchess arrived weekly, her conversation clipped and her approval carefully withheld. The Duke remained courteous but distant, absorbed in his work and parliamentary duties. He spoke to her only when necessary, his politeness precise as clockwork. Yet she noticed things. His hand lingering over the late Duchess's piano, the way his expression softened when he believed himself unobserved. He carried his grief like armor, polished until it gleamed. Eleanor's isolation might have broken a weaker spirit, but she found solace in small defiance. In tending the garden abandoned since the late Duchess's death, in reading by the library's fading firelight, in writing letters she never sent. Each act was a quiet reclaiming of herself, a reminder that though her life had been bartered, her soul remained unpurchased. And so the days stretched into weeks, the rhythm of their silent coexistence unbroken yet uneasy. Beneath civility lay a current of something unspoken, resentment, perhaps, or curiosity. He was a man haunted by loss, she, a woman marked by scandal. Both had built walls of necessity. Neither yet knew that time and fate were already chiseling at the foundations. As spring approached and the first roses began to bloom along the terrace, Eleanor stood at the window once more, watching the distant fields tremble in sunlight. The Duke passed below on horseback, his figure framed against the emerald hills. For a moment he looked up, and their eyes met through the glass, his steady, hers questioning. He inclined his head, a gesture almost imperceptible, yet it lingered within her long after he rode away. It was then she understood. Though their marriage had begun as refuge and duty, the true storm had yet to arrive. The first weeks of spring unfurled like a reluctant bloom, and Alsford Hall remained caught between grandeur and melancholy. Morning sunlight slipped through high windows, turning the air to dusted gold, yet the halls felt cold, the silence stretching between husband and wife like an invisible wall. Eleanor had learned to move through the house with quiet grace, her footsteps a whisper upon marble floors, her presence felt but seldom acknowledged. She dined in the Duke's company each evening, across a table long enough to hold an army, where conversation seldom passed beyond pleasantries. The servants, schooled in discretion, pretended not to notice the distance between their masters. To outsiders, they were the perfect couple, measured, composed, enviable in their restraint. Within, they were two lives arranged in symmetry, never touching. The Duke, for his part, was not cruel. He treated her with an impeccable civility that might have been mistaken for kindness, had it not been so flawlessly detached. His world revolved around matters of parliament, of land and law, and the perpetual management of appearances. In the few moments when Eleanor caught a glimpse of him unguarded, returning late from London, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, she saw a man held captive by expectation. He bore his title not as privilege, but as punishment. It was a weight she recognized. Both of them lived beneath the tyranny of reputation, their freedom measured by the judgment of others. Eleanor's isolation might have withered a lesser woman, yet she found purpose in small rebellions. She restored the music room, long shuttered since the late Duchess's passing. The pianoforte had gathered dust, but its keys still responded with hesitant melody. When she played, soft notes drifted through corridors and used to warmth, and now and then she thought she heard footsteps pause outside the door. She tended the gardens, coaxing life from neglected soil. The housekeeper disapproved but said nothing. Soon the grounds began to breathe again, violets creeping between the hedges like secrets reborn. It was in the library, however, that her world shifted. One evening, heavy clouds gathered, and thunder rolled across the moors. Seeking refuge from the storm, Eleanor wandered into the great chamber where the Duke kept his books, shelves of leather-bound volumes, the scent of dust and history thick in the air. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the portraits of Alsford ancestors. She traced her fingers along the spines until one title caught her eye, a French novel, banned by propriety for its frank treatment of passion and disillusionment. She opened it, half amused by her own audacity, half hungry for a glimpse of something true. When the door opened behind her, she started. The Duke stood framed in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "That book is rarely chosen," he said quietly, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "I imagine that is why it has survived," she replied, closing it gently. Her tone was polite, but her eyes held his with quiet challenge. He stepped further into the room, the firelight catching the silver in his hair. "You read French." "Well enough to be scandalized," she said, and for the first time since their marriage, he laughed, a short, genuine sound, as though he had forgotten how. The sound startled them both. They spoke then, at first cautiously, then with growing ease. She asked about his time in Parliament. He asked about her years before the scandal, her love of literature. They disagreed on nearly everything: politics, art, the notion of duty, but the disagreement itself felt alive. He was drawn to her intelligence, to the way she questioned without insolence, listened without submission. She, in turn, saw beneath his restraint a mind burdened by loyalty and guilt, a man who had mistaken discipline for virtue. As the storm raged outside, a fragile understanding formed between them. He poured her a glass of wine, and they sat by the fire, two strangers sharing warmth while pretending not to notice how near their hands had come. When the thunder faded and silence returned, he rose, his composure restored. "You have a mind unsuited to ornamental company," he said, almost softly. "I had forgotten what such a thing sounded like." From that evening onward, something imperceptible began to shift. The Duke's eyes lingered a moment longer when he greeted her. Their dinners, once marked by silence, found fragments of conversation, discussions of books, politics, gardens. The servants noticed, though they would never say so. Eleanor's presence softened the hall. Her laughter, rare but genuine, echoed faintly against the marble. The Duke, who had lived as though affection were a relic of youth, began to sense the danger of caring again. But affection, in the world they inhabited, was perilous. London's social season resumed with relentless splendor, and the Duke, bound by rank, was required to return to it. Eleanor followed as custom demanded, her gowns modest but impeccably made, her manner serene despite the whispers that followed them. The Tun had not forgotten her father's disgrace. Nor did it forgive her swift ascent from ruin to duchess. Invitations came laced with curiosity, conversations edged with cruelty. Women complimented her gown while dissecting her character. Men bowed with smiles that did not reach their eyes. She endured it all with unyielding poise, aware that a single misstep would feed the hungry mouths of rumor. The Duke observed her during these gatherings, watching how she stood beneath the weight of disdain without faltering. There was pride in her composure, but beneath it he sensed fragility, a loneliness that mirrored his own. He began to intervene subtly, an offered arm when whispers grew loud, a word of reassurance spoken too softly for others to hear. He had intended their union as armor. Instead, he found himself defending her not from scandal but from cruelty. Each time he did, something within him loosened, as though the mask he had worn for years had begun to crack. Yet their world thrived on masks. Among the marble halls of London's elite, emotion was weakness and reputation a weapon. The Duke's tenderness, though hidden, was noticed. Invitations became more pointed. The Dowager Duchess warned her son that sentiment, once indulged, could unravel dignity. He said little, but that night, as he stood before the fire in his study, he realized how little he cared for dignity in a world that prized hypocrisy above humanity. For Eleanor, those weeks were a quiet torment. The more she glimpsed of the man beneath his armor, the more dangerous her heart became. She had promised herself to survive, not to feel, yet the boundaries of her resolve blurred each time he looked at her with that rare, fleeting warmth. She did not yet call it love, for to do so would be to invite ruin. But she could no longer deny that she waited for the sound of his step outside her door, the trace of his scent in the corridors, the low timbre of his voice in rooms once empty. And so they continued, two souls circling one another beneath the scrutiny of England's most merciless audience. Their lives appeared unchanged, yet every glance carried the weight of possibility. The Duke's hand would brush hers by accident and linger a moment too long. Her smile, once cautious, now hinted at something unspoken. Theirs was not yet a love confessed, but a secret recognized, delicate as breath, trembling at the edge of confession. When the season drew them to the Queen's annual garden fete, a gathering where the powerful sharpened their smiles, Eleanor dressed in pale ivory, her gown simple but radiant in its honesty. She felt his gaze upon her as they descended the palace steps, and for a heartbeat, she forgot the watching world. Somewhere within her, she dared to believe that perhaps affection, once lost, could be found again. She could not know that before the afternoon's end, that fragile hope would be tested before the eyes of an empire. The royal garden stretched like a painted dream beneath the May sun, awash with silks, parasols, and the murmur of aristocratic laughter. Perfumed air carried the distant notes of a string quartet, while ladies in pastel gowns drifted between hedges trimmed with mathematical precision. It was a world choreographed to conceal its cruelty, beauty serving as mask, charm as weapon. Eleanor moved through it with composed grace, her gloved hands folded neatly around her fan, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. The ivory of her gown shimmered softly in the light, yet beneath that serenity her heart beat with careful restraint. This was her first true public appearance since her marriage, and every gaze felt like judgment dressed in curiosity. The Duke walked beside her, his expression calm, his presence commanding. Together, they appeared the model of aristocratic harmony, yet beneath the surface, tension coiled like a silent storm. Conversations hushed when they passed. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered behind painted smiles. The air was thick with speculation, of her father's scandal, of his calculated marriage, of their rumored indifference. Eleanor had learned to endure such scrutiny with the patience of someone who had nothing left to prove. But cruelty, when wrapped in elegance, could pierce more deeply than any open insult. They were near the Rose Pavilion when Lady Pembroke approached, her voice sweet as honey steeped in venom. She was a woman who delighted in the suffering of others, her eyes alight with amusement as she greeted Eleanor with false warmth. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying with exaggerated deference. "How radiant you look! It must be a relief to stand once more among society's finest, after such difficult family circumstances." The laughter of her companions, three painted women with fans like sharpened wings, followed in delicate harmony. Eleanor smiled faintly, every muscle disciplined into composure. "Society has a forgiving nature when it chooses to," she replied. Her tone was calm, but Lady Pembroke was not deterred. "Indeed," she said, feigning sympathy. "Though forgiveness often depends upon lineage. Some titles, I suppose, can only carry one so far. But we must all be grateful for the Duke's generosity. How fortunate to find a protector when misfortune comes calling." The words slid through the air like silk drawn across glass. A ripple of laughter broke among the women, polite, poisonous. Eleanor felt the burn of humiliation rise beneath her skin. She could not meet their eyes, for to do so would betray the sting. Around her, the garden blurred into light and shadow. The memory of her father's frail apology, of signing her name beside the Duke's in trembling ink, returned with sudden sharpness. Her throat ached, yet she forced her lips into a measured smile. "Fortune favors the brave, Lady Pembroke," she said softly. "And bravery, I have learned, is not always born of comfort." The words, though calm, carried steel. For a moment, silence fluttered between them. But the reprieve was short. One of the women leaned close and whispered, "Her Grace has wit, at least. Shame it cannot mend a ruined family." Laughter again, low, cruel, contagious. Eleanor's vision swam. She could feel eyes upon her from every corner, some pitying, others eager for spectacle. The Duke had been standing a few paces away, in conversation with a minister, when the sound reached him, the brittle laughter, the sharp intake of his wife's breath. He turned, and in that instant, something primal and long-suppressed stirred within him. He saw her standing amid the roses, pale but unbowed, surrounded by wolves disguised in satin. He had endured ridicule in Parliament, faced political betrayal without flinching, but the sight of his wife, his proud, quiet wife, subjected to mockery, pierced through every layer of restraint. The world seemed to still as he approached. The crowd parted instinctively. Even Lady Pembroke's smile faltered. He reached Eleanor's side without a word, his gloved hand finding hers. The touch was deliberate, protective. Then, before reason could intervene, before propriety could cage him, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it. It was not a chaste gesture, but one charged with unmistakable meaning. The garden fell silent. Fans paused mid-air, champagne glasses stilled. Eleanor froze, the world narrowing to the warmth of his mouth upon her trembling skin. It was the first time he had touched her in public with anything resembling tenderness, and it shattered the invisible barrier they had both guarded. His eyes met hers, steady, unashamed, defiant. There was no performance in his gaze, no calculated gesture for reputation's sake. What she saw was truth, stripped bare of pretense, a man who had grown weary of silence, choosing her instead. Gasps rippled through the assembly. Lady Pembroke's painted smile dissolved. Even the Queen's attendants, stationed discreetly nearby, exchanged glances of astonishment. The Duke straightened, his voice carrying through the stunned quiet. "My wife," he said evenly, "has endured the cruelty of gossip with a grace that puts all of London to shame. Those who find amusement in her dignity reveal far more of themselves than they might wish." His tone was calm, but it struck like thunder. Then, as if nothing more needed saying, he offered Eleanor his arm. She accepted it wordlessly, her fingers trembling as they intertwined with his. Together they walked away, leaving silence and astonished faces in their wake. The carriage ride home was quiet. Outside, the city unfurled in a blur of gold and shadow. Eleanor sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her heart still unsteady. The Duke's composure had returned, yet the air between them was alive with something unspoken. She wished to thank him, to tell him how much that single act had meant, but words seemed too fragile. It was he who broke the silence first. "I should have done it sooner," he said quietly. His gaze remained fixed on the window, as though speaking to the world rather than her. "I thought that distance would protect us both. I was wrong." Eleanor turned toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "You risked your reputation." He looked at her then, and the faintest smile touched his lips. Perhaps it was time reputation learned its limits. The carriage jolted as it turned onto the long road to Alsford Hall. The setting sun bled across the sky, staining the clouds crimson. Neither spoke again, but in the quiet, understanding blossomed. When they reached the estate, the Duke handed her down, his touch lingering longer than custom allowed. For the first time, he did not bid her good night with polite detachment. Instead, he met her gaze and said simply, "Eleanor." It was the first time he had spoken her name as though it mattered. In the days that followed, London's gossip columns erupted. The kiss became legend, described, debated, romanticized. Yet for all the noise, the Duke and Duchess of Alsford remained silent. Within the quiet halls of their estate, something new had taken root. Dinners became conversations, silences softened by the gentle rhythm of shared laughter. He began to accompany her on walks through the garden she had revived, his stoicism tempered by a warmth that startled even him. She, once merely grateful for shelter, found herself reaching toward the man behind the title. In that fragile equilibrium, love emerged, not in declarations or promises, but in the simple human act of choosing one another despite the world's scorn. He discovered in her not duty, but grace. She found in him not coldness, but the courage to be seen. Years later, visitors to Alsford Hall would pause before a portrait in the West Gallery. It depicted the Duke and Duchess seated together, her hand resting upon his, their eyes meeting not with grandeur but quiet devotion. Beneath it hung a small brass plaque bearing no dates, only a single inscription: "She taught him to feel, he taught her to endure." And so their legend lingered, not a scandal, nor as spectacle, but as a whisper that love, once awakened, could silence even the cruelest laughter of an empire.